So we've all seen that interaction between Trump and Zelensky at the White House. I'm sure by now you've seen it multiple times. I'm not going to break down the diplomacy or the lack of diplomacy in that interaction, but what I want to do in this video is take a larger point of view, step away from the problem and look at the entire world. What does this mean for the rest of the world? Is Donald Trump actually changing sides on this particular matter and siding with Russia? Are those the messages that we're hearing from him and his team? What does this mean for Europe? What does it mean for the rest of the world? What does it mean for China and for India? We're going to attempt to deal with all of these things in this video. Quickly reminding you, like, share, subscribe, and of course, sign up for our membership if you can. It will help us. Okay, now this has been a complex video to work on. I've tried my best. Let me know at the end if you think that we could have added more information. Donald Trump has been in office for 5 weeks, and if there's one standout feature of these 5 weeks, it's chaos. Because every day he says a different thing, and every day everyone's scrambling to figure out how seriously to take him and what it would really mean if these things actually play out. I want to remind you of that Gaza video that he put out, the AI generated video not long ago, and everybody's like, should we even take the things he says seriously? Is he still the leader of the free world? What is going on? And even though he keeps saying that all of his moves are America first, some of the things he does actually in many opinions doesn't leave America first, but actually hurts his own people. I want to focus right now specifically on Russia and Ukraine, and his moves are an indication that he's actually changing the US's tone towards Russia. And this is a massive departure from the stand that US has taken for the last 3 years since this war has broken out between Russia and Ukraine. The US has been steadfast under Biden as to how it felt about it and where it stood. Also remember, the US and Europe, that's an alliance that goes back almost 80 years, right? Is he changing his mind on these two things, and what is the evidence so far? So first, I want to present you with the evidence of, is Donald Trump leaning towards Russia more? Evidence piece number one. The United States sided with Russia in 2 votes in the United Nations. This has almost never happened before. Historically, we know that the US uses its very powerful veto at the United Nations to actually block resolutions that are critical to its allies. Remember, it always stands by Israel repeatedly during the entire onslaught in Gaza. It never once wavered from that point. Now, regarding Russia, the US typically supported resolutions condemning the actions of Russia. It had done so when we were talking about Crimea back in 2014 as well. Under President Trump, there has been a notable shift. February 2025, there was a United Nations General Assembly resolution that urged Russia to withdraw its forces from Ukraine. The US vetoed that particular resolution. The United Nations Security Council also had a resolution that was backed by the US, then supported by Russia, called for a swift end to the conflict. But here's the thing, in that resolution, which was actually brought in, it did not call Russia an aggressor, and it did not acknowledge Ukraine's territorial integrity. So it said the conflict must end, and first of all called it a conflict and not a war. It said the conflict must end, but it did not say that Russia needs to withdraw its troops from the land that it has already annexed out of Ukraine. And that caused everybody to sit up and say, hang on, what's going on here? Why is the United States, departing from its policy and actually supporting Russia in the United Nations? The second thing that happened, February 14th, there was a Munich Security Conference in which Vice President J.D. Vance had attended. And while he was expected to use his speech to address a possible end of the war in Ukraine, what he did instead, he spent most of his speech accusing European governments, including the UK, these are all allies, of retreating from their values, of ignoring voter concerns about migration, about free speech, and apparently, according to reports, there was just silence in the room when he was speaking, and then later a German defense minister actually said that what he said was completely unacceptable. The fact that he had actually taken on Europe instead of talking about Russia, and he said also in his speech that the greatest threat that Europe is facing is not from Russia and China, but from within. The third piece of evidence is then when Trump was meeting French President Macron earlier this week, he refused to call Vladimir Putin a dictator, and he called Zelensky of Ukraine a dictator instead last week, and everybody again stopped for a second to figure out what is going on. Now, the fact that he called Zelensky a dictator, he's rolled back in the last 24 hours, and he literally said this. He said, and I'm quoting, "Did I say that? I can't believe I said that," but he did say it, and it's on camera. The other most important thing is about 2 weeks ago in Saudi Arabia, top US diplomats and Russian officials met at a meeting that was hosted by Saudi Arabia to discuss a possible end, a deal to the war in Ukraine. It was apparently a meeting that did not invite Ukraine to the conversation, did not invite anybody from Europe to the conversation. So effectively, Donald Trump was under the impression that his team could sit down with the Russian team and they could sort this out among themselves. They didn't have to invite actually Ukraine to the table at all. It was almost immediately after that meeting that Trump made a statement blaming Ukraine for the conflict. He actually said, "You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. You've let it go on this far." And he's repeatedly said that Ukraine's leaders should have never allowed the conflict to begin, effectively suggesting that when Russia made demands about territory, Ukraine should have simply conceded. And that is something, again, that the world has not been able to sort of reconcile with. Another piece of evidence is that the US under Trump has blocked vehemently Ukraine's spot at NATO. Now, I must point out here that Ukraine's never had a spot at NATO, and even in the past, it has not received one. But it just seems here now, the US Secretary of Defense under Trump has said that the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO is unrealistic. I want to take a quick detour here because NATO is really important in this conversation. So just to remind you from your 7th standard classes that you studied, NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was started in April 1949. It's an organization with headquarters in Brussels right now. There are 31 countries part of this organization. And if I were to simply bring it down to the basics, the key principle of this organization is if you attack any one member, it's considered an attack on all, and they have shared defenses and they defend all their territories together. Now, this actually came about after World War II and in response to the Cold War as well. The idea that European nations, most of these countries are European nations, mostly countries that consider themselves first world, and America and Canada and Australia, if I'm not mistaken, they basically have come together saying we will look after each other and we will fight together and we will sort of commonly build defense together. America is a very important part of NATO because it has nuclear prowess and because it has ability to put bases all around Europe. It also gives America a certain ability to put its forces all over Europe and to sort of be the leader of the free world, as they like to call it. There's a large sort of idea now that Donald Trump wants to pull America out of NATO completely, and I'll get to that in a minute. So that is all of the background that we are seeing so far, where Donald Trump is pushing more and more, it seems, to not have to support NATO or Europe, or not have to continue to send money and arms to Ukraine to fight this war. Now, the deal that Donald Trump's US was actually looking at with Ukraine is called a rare minerals deal. Now, I'll give you a quick understanding of what this is as well. This is why Zelensky was in the White House. So basically, Ukraine has a lot of rare elements or minerals that it can mine. It's got lithium, titanium, and things that are needed for semiconductors and batteries and defense systems. Ukraine needs money to rebuild after the war is over. And US is interested in these resources because right now it's dependent on China for a lot of these resources. So the deal was basically to create a US-Ukraine minerals agreement, to create a joint investment fund that will look at mining these resources. 50% of all revenues from those resources will be put in that fund, and the US would have owned a massive portion of that fund, and portions of that fund would be used to rebuild Ukraine. That was the deal that was meant to be closed last night in the White House. When Zelensky actually, after that interaction, left the White House early without completing his full visit, we understand that that deal has not been signed. And just to give you, I mean, if there's anybody who lived under a rock who hasn't understood what happened, there was basically a shouting match. You could have mistook it for a Indian TV channel debate, what was happening in the White House, in the Oval Office, while there were journalists there waiting for a briefing, asking questions. These three men actually started abrasively shouting at each other. Vice President Vance actually told Zelensky that he should have entered a deal with Putin. He said that Zelensky is being disrespectful to come to the Oval Office and say this in front of the media. He has asked him, to be grateful. You've not said thank you, he said. Trump actually said, you've done enough talking, you're not winning it. You've got to be thankful you don't have the cards. To which Zelensky said, I'm very serious, I'm not playing cards, I'm a president in a war. So Trump then went on to say, you are gambling with World War III. And this is really important. He said, what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, to this country. It's backed you far more than other people. And Vance said, you've not said thank you even once in this entire meeting. So it really seemed acrimonious and unpleasant and something that we're not used to. But maybe this is Trump's new way of doing business. And now that he's doing business this way, is the rest of the world also going to start looking at a diplomacy that's not very diplomatic? And everybody sort of pulled back to say, what are Trump's intentions here for basically creating a dumpster fire out of what should have been a diplomatic meeting? Why did he let the whole thing go to bits? Now, there's one article written by the international editor of BBC called Jeremy Bowen, and he has said, I'm quoting his article, he says, there are suspicions now that the public row was a planned political mugging, either to force Zelensky to do America's bidding or to participate in a crisis that will allow them to blame everything on Zelensky no matter what happens next. Now, again, there are many ramifications for what Trump is doing. If he is, in fact, for example, moving America's loyalties from Ukraine to Russia, effectively could also mean he's moving America's loyalties from Europe to Russia. And I want to take a minute here to explain the ramifications or the impact of what that would mean. Now, the most important one is this would basically signal a massive crisis for Europe, for NATO, because it's not just the security of Ukraine, it's the security of Europeans as well. Remember, it's one land mass. And if Russia feels it can help itself to Ukraine, and nobody is going to actually defend, or America is not going to defend Ukraine's Ukraine's territory, sovereign territory, and say, okay, now we will stop the war, whatever Russia already has is. So what is stopping Russia from going further and further? And remember, there's all of Europe there. It's all one land mass, except for America that has an ocean in between, which is what Zelensky was referring to when he said you have the protection of an ocean, and that might not always be the case. There were some analysts on American television who said, this is how America felt in the Second World War. They felt that because there's an ocean of space between them and Europe, it's not so bad. But then Pearl Harbor happened, and that is a lesson that America keeps in mind when it does its diplomacy. So really, again, it's not making sense what Trump is doing right now. But what this does is it casts doubts over US's commitment to European security, and also whether Trump will continue to be part of NATO. Remember, it was President Harry Truman back in 1949 who decided to set up NATO and be part of that entire system, and it's been followed since then. So what Europe is going to be asking now in terms of questions is, will Trump be really serious about defending Europe if it comes to that? Now, NATO has safeguarded the US and the transatlantic security for 75 years. Democratic presidents, Republican presidents, no one has questioned it until now. But Trump has questioned it repeatedly. This is not the first time. He has repeatedly in his first term and now talked about how he believes that the allies impose very large budgetary burdens of that defense on the US. He believes that the US is carrying a larger burden than it should. And he says the allies save money on defense because America is spending on defense, and they use that money to better their industry instead. And they outcompete the United States in trade, and they take American jobs. So he doesn't believe it's a fair system for America. And he also does not appear to share a view that a stable, secure Europe is important for the national interest of America, which was what the previous, all of the previous presidents have believed. It seems that he doesn't seem to believe that. He doesn't seem to believe that America needs to defend Europe in order to also defend itself, maintain some sort of stability for itself. Now, Trump follows, if he actually follows through on what he's threatened and allows for these talks to break down, and he freezes military aid to Ukraine, Ukraine will have to fight on its own. And the question is, for how long could it possibly fight on its own? It doesn't have the monetary power to do so, and it doesn't have the arms and ammunition to do so. So then will the rest of the European allies have to pick up that slack? Because, like I said, Europe sees this also as a threat to its own safety. And it's not just an ideological or a principle thing. In fact, I want to point out that about a week ago, French President Emmanuel Macron called an emergency meeting of Germany, Britain, Italy, Poland, Spain, Netherlands, Denmark, as well as the heads of the European Council, European Commission, and NATO Secretary General. What were they discussing? Is Europe feeling particularly vulnerable now because the US seems to have pulled away from something that was always taken for granted, that the US and Europe will stand together? But at this point, a lot of the analysts are also saying that all of these European countries have very strangled budgets, and they may not have the ability to as quickly find the money or create defense spending that will be able to help Ukraine and also support themselves. And let me remind you as well that the nuclear ability for NATO largely comes from America. And so if Trump were to sort of pull off that umbrella per se and not allow that protection, then what happens to the members of the European alliance? That's the big question. So that's the impact on Europe. Let's look at the impact of Russia next. Now, there are a lot of concerns that not only this is not just about Ukraine, but also Donald Trump is actually looking to restore a strong relationship with Putin and Russia, and that will obviously make Russia more powerful. Now, there was a CNN editorial dated the 17th of February that effectively said Trump's administration has ended Putin's international isolation. It has shattered Western unity on this conflict and cast doubt as to how far US will go to defend Europe. Now, Trump's aides, apart from this, have also been making a lot of statements that sort of suggests that, President Trump would be happy to agree to a deal, even if it's a bad one for Ukraine, even if it means that the borders are redrawn to Ukraine's disadvantage, as long as he can get a deal on the table. Now, the president has called also to return Russia, Trump has called to return Russia to the G8 group of industrial nations, and Russia was kicked out after they annexed Crimea back in 2014. And Trump has repeatedly questioned Biden's sort of willingness to side with Ukraine over this entire conflict. And then, of course, there was the talks in Saudi. All of these things are drawing, questions, but all these things will be great for Putin, who's going to be really happy with all of the developments that he's hearing about. In fact, I want to point this out to you. After what happened last night at the White House, Kaja Kallas, who is the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security, she wrote a statement saying, "Today it has become clear that the free world needs a new leader, and it is up to us Europeans to take this challenge." So it's a really interesting sort of change of world order that we may be witnessing if we want to take what Trump does and what he says seriously. It's difficult not to, though, because he is arguably the most powerful man in the world, except for maybe Elon Musk. So should we take him seriously? Now, the other country that's going to be watching very carefully at this point is China. This is interesting and important to China. If, for argument's sake, the United States backs away from Ukraine and doesn't defend Ukraine's territorial integrity, what message does that send China about, say, Taiwan and about the smaller islands in its neighborhood that China has sort of quietly been saying, oh no, this is mine and this is also mine. So does that send a message to China that saying, you know, now it's, if you're strong enough to hold off, it's up for grabs? The other interesting thing this leaves for China is if Europe, if America right now is being so acrimonious or so difficult towards Europe and sort of, as we've seen it do, kick a lot of its own allies in the knees, including, say, Canada and the UK and Europe, then does that leave room for China to put on a charm offensive and actually charm Europe and sort of build an idea of friendship? So observers at the Munich Security Conference, the one that G.D. Vance had spoke to, where Vance had actually gone after, you know, European democracies, they've actually said that at that point, there was a much softer tone towards China. President, you know, the European Commission president had actually made a statement, and she acknowledged Europe's need to adapt to shifting global power dynamics and emphasized the need of strengthening, you know, strategic autonomy and aligning to some degree with China's long-standing call for a more independent European foreign policy. So is it possible, if the US is no longer such a steadfast ally for Europe, that China will have room for some alliances over there as well, or at least a softer relationship with Europe? That's an interesting thing. What does it mean for India? Now, it basically, India has relationships with Russia, and we have relationships with the US, obviously. And India is going to be watching very carefully to sort of figure out, you know, where it stands in all of this and how it's going to navigate each of these relationships differently. But remember, in the Biden era, India was a very key partner in that Indo-Pacific strategy because of geographically being located where we are, being such a strong democracy, and we were a good ally to the West against China. Now we'll have to figure out what all of that means. Remember also, we are part of the Quad Alliance, which is basically India, Japan, Australia, US. And we'll have to see how Trump feels about that alliance as well, and where that, you know, effectively leaves us and what powers we still have. There are a lot of moving things that are happening across the world right now, that mainly because Donald Trump likes drama. He makes really big statements. He is behaving towards a lot of other countries simply like a schoolyard bully, in many cases still getting his way. The question is, at what point will the global community put its foot down? America is a very powerful country. It is powerful culturally, monetarily, you know, militarily. But this is not Donald Trump's doing. This is, you know, several governments and several presidents and the work of many, 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 many people over many years. So is it right for Trump to be using this power now to sort of squander a lot of the goodwill that America has built? Remember, by pulling USAID, changing a lot of the soft power that US has across the world, saying we don't need it anymore because we're too powerful to need it. He's within his rights perhaps to do so, but the question is, how long is the global community going to allow him to do so? And when is that line, where is that line that's likely to be crossed? Leave me a comment in the comment section about what you believe is really happening. If you believe that America actually siding with Russia and changing the world order as we've known it since we were born, really, what is that going to leave the whole world with? Thanks for watching.